So my name, for those who don't know me, I could hear a few people in the chat do, but my name is Aviva Dorch. I'm the executive director and the publisher of Jewish Renaissance magazine. We're a cultural organisation as well as a magazine. We do lots of events, tours, short breaks. We run programmes for emerging Jewish creatives. But mainly our kind of showcase is that we publish a quarterly arts and culture magazine that looks at the best of British Jewish culture and Jewish culture internationally around the world. Um, Today has been inspired because there is a new play coming out, which Rebecca, my colleague, is going to tell you all about in a moment. But that gave us the inspiration to reflect back on Brian Epstein, the Beatles, and the relationship with the Liverpool Jewish community. So some of you might have seen some articles in the magazine leading up to this, and I hope you're also going to enjoy a lot of cultural viewing after this event, because some of our speakers tonight have produced very, very interesting work about Brian Epstein. I'm taking a moment though to do what everybody in the Jewish community connected with Liverpool does, which is tell their story about the Beatles. We were having a chat before this started and saying everyone has a link. So here is mine. This is a school photo from 1957 from Quarry Bank School in Liverpool. So the red circle at the back is, I'm hoping people recognise John Lennon. What you might not recognise is who you might not recognise is his French teacher sitting in the front row with all the masters, as they were called then. That's actually Harry Dorch, my father. So my dad was John Lennon's French teacher. And I grew up with a few of the stories, and I've had more every time I go to Liverpool. Someone else tells me a story about my dad. But really interestingly, a few years ago, some of Lennon's detention records went on sale. So they were discovered, a few pages that had been torn out the detention book were discovered. And actually, there have been two different sales of about 3 pages each. And the nice thing for me is, I'm not sure it was so fun for John Lennon, is it seems like the master who gave him more detentions than anyone else was indeed my father. So you can see here HD, that's Harry Dorch, chewing and silliness. There's another one up there for talking. My favourite wasn't on this sheet, but it wasn't one I could get a copy of. Once my dad gave John Lennon detention for singing in the corridor. So I thought it was a very fun story, but then it built. So when these records went to auction, Sotheby's commissioned some research on them. And they asked Rod Davis, who was in the Quarrymen at Quarrybank School with John Lennon, to find information and identify all the teachers. So this is what he said about my dad. So that Harry Dorch was John's French teacher, a kind and charming man with a great sense of humour. However, John obviously did his best to prevent him teaching anything by fooling around in class. In John's school report from Christmas 1955, Mr. Dorch wrote, a disappointing result. He's so fond of obtaining a cheap laugh in class, he has little time left for serious concentration. I have to say, my dad would be sadly disappointed in me too, because I quite love a cheap laugh as well. Um, but I thought it was a really fun thing. And then I heard a little bit more. So if you go to this record, which I'm sure many people in the audience have, there's a song on it called Getting Better, written by McCartney and Lennon. I'm just going to play you a few seconds of the lyrics. Just a little hint there. So the song's actually mostly written by McCartney, but apparently that verse about the teachers and not having a good time at school was all from Lennon about people like my dad, because Paul McCartney was a model student, John Lennon not so much. And we picked up the Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts a few years ago. We had the 20th anniversary of JR, and you might recognise the influence on our front cover, beautifully done by our art director, Becky Redman. So there's a little Jewish Renaissance link to the Beatles, but actually we've got speakers tonight with many more links than me. But this gives you a taste of what we're going to try and do, because we've got professional playwrights, screenwriters, and academics who are thinking about the cultural context and presenting their own work. But we're interspersing that with some anecdotes from other people in the Liverpool Jewish community who had their own connections. So I really hope you enjoy all that we're offering. And please, if you like what we're doing, maybe support JR as well. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca Taylor, who is our editor, and she's going to be chairing tonight, and invite her to introduce our speakers. Rebecca, over to you.
Hello, and thank you, Aviva, for your wonderful story about your father. That was, yeah, a great insight into the pre-Beatles John Lennon. So, hello, everyone. As Aviva said, I'm Rebecca Taylor, the editor of Jewish Renaissance. Welcome to our event tonight on Brian Epstein and the Beatles. Just to say, my own connection is nothing as interesting as that. But when I had my bat mitzvah back in the early 1980s, amongst all the Magen David silver necklaces and books on Jewish history and book vouchers, I was given by a South African friend of ours, Cheryl, wherever she is now, a friend of the family, a vinyl LP of Rubber Soul. And that was my absolute favorite and most treasured gift from my bat mitzvah. I still have it today. So that began my lifetime love of the Beatles. And I'm sure many of you have similar Beatles moments in your lives. But tonight we're going to go back and look at the beginning of that story, focusing on the man who made it happen, the Jewish Liverpudlian pop impresario Brian Epstein. And the reason, as Aviva mentioned, that we're looking at him right now is because in April, a new play, Please Please Me, opens at London's Kiln Theatre. And that's going to focus on this brilliant and complex and sometimes troubled man. I'm going to tell you very little about Brian because I know some of it will be covered by our speakers, but just to give you a little bit of background, Brian was the eldest son of a Jewish family that ran a retail business in Liverpool, and they also ran North End music stores known as NEMS, the record shop that Brian managed early in his career. And when a boy came into NEMS requesting a record by the Beatles, My Bonnie, Brian decided to seek them out. He went to see them play a lunchtime session at the Cavern Club and was immediately struck by their energy and charisma. He became their manager, got them to swap their leather jackets and long hair for suits and mop crops, and engineered their string of early hits such as Love Me Do and Please Please Me. He secured the band's appearance on the US show, the Ed Sullivan Show. He steered the band through their international tours and the history of Beatlemania. Although he found fame, money, and enormous success with the Beatles and the other Liverpool groups he managed, which we shouldn't forget, such as Cilla Black and Gerry and the Pacemakers, he also lived his life as a gay man and faced all the vulnerabilities and sometimes violence and intimidation that gay people faced at a time when homosexuality was illegal. And in August 1967, he was found dead from an accidental overdose, aged just 32. But now we're going to rewind back to the beginning of his remarkable story with the help of our panel tonight. So we have Tom Wright, the author of Please Please Me, or the writer behind Please Please Me, I should say. Les Lancaster, who is based at Liverpool John Moores University and is a member of Liverpool's Prince's Road Synagogue. Brigit Grant, the scriptwriter on Midas Man. We also hear from Linda Grant, who the novelist who has made a little recording for us. And we'll hear from Aviva Dorch, the executive director of Jewish Renaissance, who you've just heard about. Oh, well, we've heard from her already about her own family's connection. We've heard from Aviva. So just to say, we'll have a time for a short Q&A at the end. So please put your questions in the chat. We've got a very packed night for you, so keep them brief. Keep yourself mute, and we'll start with Tom. So we're going to go over to Tom Wright now. Tom is a writer, director, and dramaturg for theatre and film. He was appointed artistic director of Leeds Playhouse in March 2025. Before that, he was the associate artistic director at London's Kiln Theatre, and before that, he was head of artistic development at the Old Vic. His latest play, Please Please Me, opens at the Kiln in April. So Tom, let's go over to you, and you're going to tell us about the inspiration for Please Please Me.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Aviva, for that story. What an amazing way to start. Going to be hard to top that. That's fantastic. And what a lineup you've got. I can't wait to hear everyone else speak, and I'm honored to be speaking so early in the talk. Presuming no one necessarily knows the plays that I've written so far, one of the reasons I was drawn to Brian's story is because all my work aims, at least my writing work, aims to explore and excavate LGBTQ experiences in the UK. Primarily at first, the contemporary experiences of myself, my peers, things that were happening in the world. But then moving on to looking into the past and finding queer stories that we haven't heard, uncovering histories that need a bit more exposure. So that's kind of what has brought me to writing this play about Brian. And originally I was reflecting when I was thinking about speaking today. I was commissioned by Indu Rubasingham, who was the artistic director of the Kiln. She now runs the National Theatre of Great Britain. So a really impressive woman. And I originally I wanted to write a play set in the 60s, but I wasn't necessarily going to write about Brian. And that wasn't because I wasn't interested and a bit obsessed with him, but I guess I was a bit daunted about writing about a real person. Up until Please Please Me, I haven't written about anyone. I haven't written about real people. I've always had fictionalized accounts that are based in truth, emotional truth, but not about people who lived or live. So, but I was interested in the era. I'd just finished writing a play set in the 40s, and I was sort of moving through time, and was quite interested in the period just before decriminalization, and particularly the experience of gay men, many of whom in the entertainment industry were known to be gay, were able to be hugely successful in their field. But at the same time, because of social attitudes, because of criminalization, also sort of fostered this deep unhappiness, which I think is really apparent in Brian's story. So I was kind of talking about that era, and I kept using Brian as an example of that, as a really great example. And Indu really astutely said, Tom, I think you should just write about Brian. You clearly really like his story. And yeah, I was a bit averse at first because I thought, can I honor him? Is that something that I really want to do? But it did feel wrong to be writing a fictionalized account of someone like Brian when his story was so brilliant. So, and I already knew about Brian because very briefly, I originally started my career as an actor. I didn't last very long, but I was in a show about the Beatles. I played Ringo Starr. So at the time, being a young gay man playing that role, the character of Brian was portrayed very briefly in that piece. So I already had a bit of an obsession with the Beatles and a real interest in Brian. So began a lot of research that's required writing about a real person and sort of going back to a lot of the stuff that I did when I did that play. And one of the things that stood out to me quite early on that I guess gave me the permission to write the play was a quote in Brian's autobiography. Now, he didn't write this, so he had he worked with a writer, and it came out pre-decriminalization. So he wasn't able to talk about so much in that book. Anyone who's read it will know it's quite slight, really. But there's a quote here I'll just briefly read. He said, I don't mind people delving deep into me, searching for reasons and secrets, because there's nothing too bad there. Even if there were something to be ashamed of, if it were true, and it were known, and it were published, I could not complain. I'm extremely fond of the truth. And for me as a playwright, that I felt that was the permission I sort of was waiting for. And I think if theatre can attempt to do anything, it's finding the truth in things, finding the emotional truth. And I think that's what my quest has been with this play. And lots of things then fascinated me about Brian's experience. And dare I say it, not that in any way I'm close to his levels of success. I started to feel like I understood him and saw elements of myself in him as a young gay man who works in the arts. And I guess I was well, there's so much to talk about. Let's think which bits. Okay, so in his early life, some of the things that interest me that I'd love to share for this conversation, there were some incidents that specifically, I think, elements of his gay life that might have impacted the decisions he made with the Beatles. And as I was reading, a lot of biographers talk about Brian's gay life, but maybe it's a bit of a footnote, it's brushed past. And that was the area of his experience that I was really fascinated by, and how that impacted decisions he made with the Beatles, because I felt like there was a really strong correlation. And loads of elements. So early in his life, you might already know, Brian was arrested for cottaging in London. He was also caught when he was cruising in the docks in Liverpool, had an incident of blackmail, which I believe, and other people will have done more in-depth research, was involved in this case where this person who was doing the blackmailing was prosecuted, and Brian was involved in that and was able to go anonymous in order to give evidence. So there was these elements quite early on where the fact he was gay meant that he would have experienced deep shame, really, in having to navigate those in a time where it's still criminalized. And there's this concept in gay life some people might be familiar with that we call the velvet rage, which was sort of made famous by a book by Alan Downs. This idea that when you're born gay or queer into a straight world or a straight family, that you instinctively feel something about you is shameful, that it's wrong, that it's different. But the idea that, or one of Alan's concepts, is that it can drive you to great ambition in an attempt to prove your worth, that you aren't shameful, that you aren't unworthy. You end up overachieving. I'm going to be the strongest. I'm not going to be just as strong as everyone else. I'm going to have more sex than anyone ever has had. I'm going to be so successful that it's undeniable that I'm not just normal, I'm actually excellent. And if unchecked, we see throughout history and still today that can drive gay men to extremities and suicide and drug addiction and all these issues. So I think that struck me that happened early on in his life, and potentially some of that was what he was sort of perhaps overcompensating with the amazing things he achieved. I found it so astounding that someone who, had never managed a band, as we heard, he ran the Nems record store in an incredible way. Could lead these men to such success. Essentially, he stumbled into the cavern on this recommendation and saw these men smoking, swearing in their leather jackets. And from my lens, absolutely fancied the hell out of them. Who wouldn't? And that found that very inspiring, as well as their musical ability. His life is also one that's very sad. They achieved so much, but of course, he died at a very young age, and painfully just a month before, I believe, homosexuality was decriminalized. So he was so close to change. So for me, he's like the most highest articulation of this ability to be incredibly successful, but so deeply and tragically sad because of the context he lived in. And it's also interesting to think that as the Beatles found spirituality with the Maharishi and were giving up some alcohol or experimenting with different drugs, that Brian didn't feel like he could access that for whatever reason. despite having been born with a faith in a way that the Beatles hadn't. He felt alienated by it. Um, Similarly, the Beatles sang of love, and that's something Brian encouraged, and they were finding love. And again, Brian wasn't able to find that, which I just found so tragic. Um, the night he died, I found particularly vivid that he was at his home with two of his longest friends, oldest friends, both of whom were gay men and feature in my play, specifically to try and show a few different gay perspectives and different types of gay men in the era. His dad had recently died, which I feel was a huge impact on that. And he'd just been turned down by a guy that he'd pinned some hopes on could be a potential love interest. So all of this was swimming round, and I really felt I could imagine that night very vividly and the things that Brian was going through. Um, Keeping an eye on time because I think I've got 10 minutes. I'm bouncing around a bit. One of the other things that really fascinated me and the play really tries to explore is not only how Brian's gay life affected the Beatles, which is maybe a slightly lesser known story, but his relationship with John Lennon. And depending on who you speak to and what perspective you take, you can make different decisions on what was there. But what was clear is that they meant a lot to each other, and their relationship was complex and complicated. And again, I really wanted to explore that from my lens. I was particularly interested to learn about this holiday they'd gone on, which has become a bit of like famous in Beatles lore and explored in various different pieces of art. That I think just a few weeks after John had his first child, rather than perhaps looking after the child with Cynthia, he was on holiday with Brian Epstein in Spain, where he talked at great length at the time that they went to gay bars, they went to cruising spots, that he says as an artist he wanted to explore what that life was like. And I found that a fascinating time. And there's lots of rumors about what happened, whether him and Brian had sex in that time. And later in life, John, I believe, gone on record and jokingly said, yeah, I had sex with Brian twice. I had to do it twice, once to see what it was like, twice to see if I liked it. And that at least is what one of his biographers told me in person. And again, different people might disagree with that. But I was just interested I'm seeing Brigit shake her head, so I'm intrigued to see what she said. But whatever went down on that on holiday was interesting to me. Brian was a bit of a father figure to John. At the same time, probably the other way round. There may have been attraction there in both ways, who knows? They certainly had a lot of power over each other and needed each other for their shared success. And that in itself is quite complicated. So the play tries to look at their relationship as well as his relationship with Cilla Black, who obviously was a legendary figure in Brian's story. So I've probably already went over time. I guess my take is tried to be as rooted in fact as is possible, as is at my disposal. But I suppose in a way it is an element of an impressionistic portrait, that the parts of Brian's story, particularly his gay life, that we don't know and we can't know because of the times and how it couldn't be recorded. What were those parts of the story that and using my knowledge of queer history, but also my lived experience as a gay man, to kind of try and emotionally fill in those truths. So I'd love for you all to come and see what you think, and I can't wait to hear what everyone thinks of it. But mostly it's just been an honor to try and tell his story because he's a fascinating and legendary character. So yes, I should probably stop, and I look forward to hearing everyone speak.
Thank you, Tom. That it was just fantastic to hear about this whole world that he came from, and particularly his gay identity, of course. And I know many people are already buying up tickets for your play at the Kilns, so we're really, really looking forward to seeing that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you at the end, but we'll go now to Linda Grant. So Linda sadly isn't with us tonight. She couldn't make tonight, but she has made us a lovely we've made a recording of me speaking to her. So Linda was born in Liverpool and she's an award-winning novelist. Her novel, When I Lived in Modern Times, set in Tel Aviv, is and set in the last years of the British Mandate, won the Orange Prize for Fiction, and her 2008 novel, The Clothes on Their Backs, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Her latest novel is The Story of the Forest. So it was lovely to speak to Linda and hear about her memories and reminiscence. So, hello, Linda.
Hello.
Lovely to see you. And we're going to chat with you about all things Beatles and growing up in Liverpool in the 60s. You grew up nearby to the Beatles, to where they lived, as I understand. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, when did you first hear the Beatles? When did you hear their music?
It was in the autumn of 1962, my first term at secondary school, and there was a girl in the sixth form who was said to be going out with George Harrison. And so the older girls in school knew all about the Beatles and had been to the Cavern and seen them. When they released their first single, Love Me Do, this was brought into the school. And at lunchtimes, we used to dance, put it on the school record player and dance the Cavern Stomp. So that's when I first heard about them. Um, and we used to go and buy our records at Nem's, which was Brian Epstein's music store.
Yes. Now, in the piece you wrote for me, you said that that was the place that everyone went to buy their
Yes.
records. What was it about Nems that was so good and made it
Well,
better than other
it
places?
was the association with Brian Epstein. Brian Epstein first heard about the Beatles when customers came in and said, "Have you got the Beatles record that they recorded in Hamburg?" And he'd never heard of them. So he went down to the Cavern and became completely besotted with them and signed them up. And it was in the town centre and it was renowned as the Beatles' own record shop, really.
Okay, yeah, so it had that very direct connection with the group.
Yeah,
Yeah, and but I understand also that your family knew the Epsteins
yes.
as well.
Um, I don't know how well they knew them, but as soon as I came home and started talking about the Beatles, my parents said, "Oh, well, of course you know that you know who his parents are, don't you?" Because in Liverpool, everybody knew everybody else. It was not a large community, and so my parents kind of claimed ownership of the Beatles while also saying, as my father repeatedly said, the Beatles are a 9-day wonder.
Yes, he was stood to be corrected on that one, didn't he?
Yes,
Yeah. And you, and geographically, you were very near to where
yes.
Paul and John lived, is that right?
Well, there were
You
four
were a connection.
synagogues in Liverpool and two very strong Jewish communities in Chilwell and Allerton. And John Lennon and Paul McCartney lived very close to where I grew up. And in fact, I realized looking on a map that Paul McCartney and John Lennon would have had to have walked past my house to go to each other's houses. So they would have, and we both shared the same shopping centre, Penny Lane. So it was South Liverpool, and they would have seen people walking to shul with their prayer bags
Mm.
and yarmulkes and
Yeah, okay, interesting. So you were all part of this same
yes,
suburban, quite Jewish
yeah.
suburban experience.
Paul McCartney lived in a post-war development, council development of a small houses on Forthlin Road, and John Lennon lived in between the walls, semi-suburban, semi-detached.
Now, I know that you didn't get to meet Paul, but you did get to meet his dad.
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that, Linda.
On the bus coming home from school, a group of schoolgirls used to get off two stops early and go and stand outside Paul McCartney's house in the hopes that he would come out. We're talking about probably 1963. And of course, he wasn't there, he was long gone. But we were, what, 12, 13, we didn't really know anything about life. And one day it was pouring with rain, and I was the only mug that got off the bus and got completely drenched standing outside the house, forlorn and soaking. And Paul McCartney's father came to the door and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Is Paul in?" He said, "No, he's in London." And he said, "But you're soaking wet, come in." And he ushered me into the living room and gave me a cup of tea and a digestive biscuit. And I stayed there half an hour before the rain eased up, and I went home very disappointed.
Oh, but what a lovely story.
Yeah. But
How
I've never
sweet.
met Paul McCartney, and I've always wanted to tell him that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, how sweet. But just to track back a little bit to your memories of the cavern, you said you used to bunk off school or make an excuse to get away from school to go in the lunchtime. So how did that work? You went in your school uniform, did you? And went
Oh
down there
God,
and
no.
then
You left the school in your school uniform, and then you went into the cavern changing room to change into the clothes that you had in your school bag, which were a denim mini skirt and a black polo neck sweater. That was what you wore for the cavern.
and what was it like inside?
Um, remember a strong smell, condensation dripping down the walls, the smell of beer, I think, rotting vegetables, because it was a warehouse
Okay. Mm.
in the center of the city. It was really fetid atmosphere. And I had my first cigarette there as well.
Yeah, and was that feeling of excitement and you know you were saying you were at the epicenter, you felt you were at the epicenter of the world. Did that feel was that the feeling in the cavern? Was that the feeling in Liverpool
But
in
it wasn't just the Beatles, there were so many other groups, the Mersey and also the poetry scene, the Liverpool poets a little bit later on. There was a feeling that it was the most exciting place in the world to grow up.
and you said that you saw the Beatles play. Can you tell us a little bit about your memories of those times?
Well, a wall of sound, really, teenage girls screaming. I don't know why we screamed, but it was obligatory. I saw them twice at the Liverpool Empire and once at the Northern premiere of A Hard Day's Night in the theatre. And that was a remarkable film, which I went to with my mother.
What did she make of it?
Bored stiff.
What did you make of it?
I still think it's a wonderful film. I watch it
Mm.
regularly.
Do you? Yeah.
It's of its moment, but it's black and white, made by a very good director,
Mm.
and really quite extraordinary, quite
Mm.
avant-garde.
Yeah, yes, it really is. Yeah. Did you ever meet Brian Epstein yourself?
No,
Okay. Um, what legacy do you think was left to you and your generation from him and from the Beatles? Is it possible to say the effect it's had on you and possibly your contemporaries?
I think it was the knowledge that you lived through something really important and exciting culturally, and that it was an enormous privilege. And as you get older and you think, I don't want to be this old, you think, but the price of being this old is that I lived through those times. And we knew that something enormous was going on. And every time the Beatles released a record, they advanced, and you grew up with them. So
Mm.
as you got older and your awareness and comprehension became more sophisticated, the Beatles records became more sophisticated as well.
Do you think they had an impact on culture in a way that other great works or writers or musicians have had?
But we're still talking about them.
Mm.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney met at the Walton Village Fete in 1957. I mean, that's nearly 70 years ago. and we're still talking about them.
And huge thanks to Linda for recording that interview with me. To read about her meeting Paul's dad and her other experiences down the Cavern and in Liverpool in the 60s, you can read her article in the current edition of Jewish Renaissance magazine. So now we're going to go to a member of the Jewish community in Liverpool, to Les Lancaster. Les is founding director of the Aleph Trust. He's Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Liverpool John Moores University and Honorary Research Fellow at the Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Manchester. So Les, let's go to you. You're going to tell us a little bit about the cultural influence that the Beatles ushered in.
Thank you, Rebecca, and it's great to be here. What an evening. I look forward to how it unfolds. And yes, the cultural influence. Of course, I want to say one thing first. Tom was focused on Brian being gay, and Brian was, as it were, other on two counts. One was being gay and the other was being Jewish. And that's an important influence. But maybe we'll come back to that. Let's talk about the cultural changes. We talk about the 60s to this day. And I mean, Linda said it, didn't she? We're still talking about it. I've been watching the chats as they come up, one of the nice things with Zoom. And everyone has their memories. Everyone's talking about when they saw them. And there's no question that this was a real phenomenon. The cultural change, well, there were many changes that occurred in the 60s, and there are many reasons for those changes. This country had rationing until the mid-1950s. There was a kind of post-war depression in all kinds of ways. The 60s saw an outpouring of creativity. It wasn't just in music. There was a kind of renaissance in television. Was mentioned already, poetry. So there was something special, something buzzing in the 60s. And the Beatles were right at the core of that. And interestingly, as far as the music was concerned, another famous songwriter, Bob Dylan, also Jewish, he was also at the center of it. So that's what we're looking at. What brings about cultural transformation? And you can trace it historically. You can look at it psychologically as well. So I want to start, actually, to pick up on something Tom said. He was talking about the importance of love. And it made me think of the one song that says so much about love, which, of course, is All You Need Is Love. And there's a story around that. So some may remember, All You Need Is Love was premiered in a very special TV event. It was in June 1967, 2 months before Brian sadly died. And it was a huge hookup, a satellite connection across the world, many countries in the world. And there was an audience of something like 400 million. Why am I mentioning this? Because that is a hugely symbolic of the transitions that happened in the 60s. Interestingly enough, Brian, who worked tirelessly to promote the Beatles, to bring out their potential, Brian worked really hard to get a contract with the BBC that the Beatles should be on that program, that international satellite hookup. And why is that significant? Because, I mean, what are we doing now? We're on Zoom. How's this working? Through those systems. That's when it started. It started with the Beatles on that show in June 1967. And so when we talk about cultural change, it's not just about art. It's about the overarching changes in our sense of scale, the scale of the world. The world became a smaller place in the 1960s, and that brings change. It can't be any other way. What was Brian Epstein's role? Well, Brian was a very interesting man in all kinds of ways. He was very creative. before the Beatles, he'd been interested in fashion, in drama. He'd studied at RADA. And in some ways, you could think of him as a frustrated creative genius. And because he ended up working in a furniture shop of all things. And then, of course, he managed to get into the record shop as well. So Brian had great insight. He went down those steps to the cavern, as we've heard, and what he saw was the potential of this group, these four individuals. And, you know, he said really early on, he said, they are going to be greater than Elvis. No one believed him. He couldn't get a record contract for this group. I mean, it's all well known. It's all, you know, in the historical record. So he saw the potential of the Beatles to bring about a huge leap in creativity. I think he was fascinated by John Lennon in particular, but he was interested in all of them. And he shaped them. You know, there's a quote from Bob Wooler, who was the DJ in the Cavern at the time. He said the Beatles existed as an entity before Brian Epstein, but Brian Epstein created them. And again, if you look back, there is something very special about the way in which that creation took shape. He dressed them. He encouraged them to bow after each song. He packaged them in a way that didn't deny their own talent, but in a way that brought them into people's lives. And that's what made the change. And so they became a huge phenomenon. Speaking a little psychologically here, changes of that order don't, as it were, happen out of the blue. And it's not just the product of one individual, or even in this case, 4 or 5 individuals. The Beatles were geniuses. There's no question. The music is fantastic. I'm sure most of us still listen to it today. But there was something else going on. There was something about the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And Brian was able to harness that. Someone in one of the chats was talking about not being able to hear them at a concert. Why? Because of all the screaming. And Linda mentioned that as well. What's all that screaming about? There was a hysteria. This is mass hysteria. This hysteria, this level, takes shape when there is a mass transition. Like I say, it's not just these individuals, it was the spirit of the age. And we still are in the wake of those changes. Brian Epstein was not a manager like any of the other managers. You know, most of the other managers at pop groups, they were in it for the money, wanted to get what they could. He's on record, he's saying he doesn't like to be called their boss. He said, I'm their friend, and I happen to be their manager. He lived his own life through the Beatles, which you can view it as positively or negatively. It had a very sad ending, and trying to live through someone else is never really a healthy thing to do. But would the Beatles have achieved what they achieved without Brian Epstein? Well, we will never know the answer to that question. As I said, they had huge talent on their own. But I think Brian was a huge impetus into projecting the Beatles into the worldwide phenomenon that they became. And I think we've all gained from that. Whether we like the music or not, we've gained because there was a huge shift in consciousness. And that's what we're still living today. And we're reaping the benefits of that in many ways. I don't know if that was 10 minutes. I can say more if you want.
That's great, Les. We'll leave it there for now, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to come back and talk about some of the things that you didn't get a chance to talk about.
I look forward to it.
Right now, but just because we're still on a bit of a patch program, we'll move on. But thank you so much for giving us that wider sense of what the Beatles meant and Brian's part in that. So we're going to go now to a short clip by made by Robin Makin. Robin is a member of the Liverpool Jewish community as well, and he grew up next door to the Epstein family. And in this clip, he interviews some of those in Liverpool about their memories of Brian and when they first saw him. And his father, Rex, was a solicitor, and he became involved in some of Brian's affairs and the family's affairs. And we hear a little bit about that as well. So we're going to see a short video clip now and hear more about those early days.
Talking about the 9th of November 1961, Brian Epstein makes a little wander over from Whitechapel to Matthew Street. And were you both there on that day?
Yes, we both were there.
And so perhaps you can each say whether you noticed or remember Brian Epstein's appearance. So, David.
Yeah, well, he was a complete incongruity, immaculately dressed, white shirt with a tie. I can't remember if it was red or blue, but he stood out, and he was staring down the central aisle, watching the Beatles play, absolutely enthralled. I can still see him there, standing there.
Debbie.
Yes, my vision is similar to David's. We knew who Brian was because we bought all our records from them, so he was no surprise to us. And he was standing at the back of the centre aisle, and then in the interval when the Beatles went into the band room, he went in to chat with them, and then he came out and looked at their second set again, and then he left with his PA, Alistair Taylor, and they went to a little cafe off Dale Street called the Peacock Cafe, and Brian said to Alistair, what did you think? And Alistair said, I think they're dreadful. He said, but I think they're fantastic. And Brian said, do you think I could manage them? And as they say, the rest is history.
Bob Wooler died several years ago, but some of his artefacts are in this wonderful book, and we perhaps go to one day in history, which was Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, and there was an event, a birthday party at Paul McCartney's aunt's house in Highton, but a rather unsavoury incident that is well captured in this book here. And what happened on that day was that John Lennon had a rather too much to drink. Bob Wooler, as we know, was gifted in comments and making comments, and made a comment that was certainly taken the wrong way by John Lennon, who then rather aggressively attacked Bob Wooler. Bob Wooler needed to be taken into hospital, and thereafter Bob Wooler consulted my late father Rex about a claim and what he should do about it. Now, obviously my father, we lived next door in 199 Queen's Drive to the Epsteins in 197 Queen's Drive, and Brian used to seek my father's advice on many aspects. So my father was aware that this was potentially going to be something of a major problem if the matter had gone into the hands of the police. Then presumably John Lennon would have been prosecuted for quite a serious assault, and the consequences would have been quite difficult. So between Brian Epstein and my father, a telegram was sent, probably by Brian Epstein, in the name of John Lennon, to Bob Wooler, apologising, expressing regret, and a financial settlement of a substantial sum was made, and a deal was done behind closed doors, and everybody got on happily.
When I was in my very early 20s and attempting to make my way as a newspaper journalist, I was given the chance of a one-day trial at the Daily Mail. It was August Bank Holiday Monday in 1967. And the news desk called and told me to go straight to Chapel Street in Belgravia and stand outside the house of Brian Epstein, who had died the day before. There were about 7 or 8 male reporters already there, and what we needed to know was it a drug overdose, was it accidental, and who would take over the management of the Beatles? Well, nothing happened all morning. And at lunchtime, one of the male reporters explained that they were off to the pub and I was to stay and tell them if anything happened. Well, luckily what happened was that Rex came down the steps of the house and he was looking for a cab, and I offered him a lift to Euston in my car. So he told me the overdose was probably accidental and that the management of the Beatles would depend on the boys and Clive, Brian's brother. He gave me a front page exclusive and a job on the Daily Mail.
Many thanks to Robin Makin for putting that together for us. Thank you, Robin. That was great to hear. We are going to go now to Brigit Grant. Well, we'll go in a minute. We're going to see a clip first, but let me just introduce Brigit. Brigit is a journalist and scriptwriter, and her 2024 film Midas Man, which is about Brian Epstein, was her first feature film. And she's currently working on another film, 10 Miles, which is a drama about Denmark's occupation in World War II. So as I say, before we go to Brigit, we're going to see a little trailer from her film, Midas Man, and then we'll hear more from Brigit about that.
Hello, my name is Brian Epstein.
Hello, my name is John Lennon. My name is Paul McCartney.
George Harrison, how do you do?
Pete Durst.
What I saw on that stage, I shall never forget it. I want to represent you, be your manager.
Well, you've got no experience, Mr. Brian.
Well, how hard can it be?
They're good musicians. I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole.
Those boys will be bigger than Elvis.
Our roster of artists spreading the Liverpool sound to every town in the country.
I heard that you almost pushed your flight home with my boy. They call that Beatlemania.
Now, the Beatles!
You have to take it slow.
Slow down. I've hardly started.
You've got so much heart. Give it to someone.
Your brother asked me to ask you why you've got a Mr. Tex Ellington on a retainer.
I built this business. If my brother has something to say to me, he can say it to my bloody face!
You never were like other children. You reached for the stars.
I Want to Hold Your Hand is #1 in America. I promise I will be there to look after you. You're a hard act to follow.
So Brigit, congratulations on the film, and please tell us about what must have been incredible research that went into writing it and your experience of being involved with it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and it's lovely to be with people who like Brian as much as I do, because I have to say that having been on this film for what feels like eternity before it actually came out, well, he feels like family to me now. You know, there were many conversations I had late at night in here in writing the script, just me and Brian, or Brian and Queenie, his mother, or Harry. You know, capturing Brian and who he was when he was a boy, and then latterly, was my brief from the producers. They wanted everything, but it's the nature of film that sadly, when it comes to budget and time, and we had COVID in between, that it everything I put in my first draft isn't in that movie, and there's definitely a series to come out of it. When I started, basically I read loads and loads about Brian, and and then gradually I decided that that wasn't going to be enough. I would need to meet people that knew him, and one of the key people was his first cousin, Basil Hyman, who is sadly no longer with us. But Basil was a couple of years younger than Brian, and they spent an inordinate amount of time together. He told me everything about who Brian was as a person, how he was the perfect gentleman, how he wanted to act a certain way in a room, but also how much he was as a family man. And a lot of that I put into the script, the original script for the film. His many boarding schools, his time in the army, which of course didn't last. And it was at that point that his homosexuality came to the fore. His gay life was a big part of the original draft, because I thought that was crucially important, much like Tom, as to who he was. The fact that he had to live this life in the shadows, which is the line in the film, and that he knew or felt that he would be such a huge disappointment to his family. And I mean, interestingly, because of the Jewish community and how well known the Epstein, and I'm emphasizing Epstein because Brian himself made a point of saying that that was his name. And when he started at the pronunciation of his name, Epstein was how John Lennon said it, and a lot of people in Liverpool, but it was Epstein. And when he started his various boarding schools, he would make a point of telling people that that was the pronunciation. And in fact, when he moved from Liverpool to London, when NEMS got so big and he moved with the Beatles to a London office right by the Palladium, his big thing was the fact that he said to Harry, they had a conversation about should he change his name. And Harry said, well, maybe you should, it's a Jewish name. He said, my name, I'm proud of my name. I will tell people how to say it. And I will, you have to remember, it's the music business. It can only serve me well. But he was very particular. So I do shudder a bit when people say Epstein. I believe Jeremy Corbyn would have called him Epstein. But there you go. So the other person I spent lots of time with was Frida Kelly, who was not only Brian's secretary, but she ran the Beatles fan club. And she was at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday. She got all the fan mail at the house, at their little Liverpool house, to the point where her dad turned around and said, no, can't find the electricity bill. And obviously she saw Brian at his worst too. And it was actually John Lennon who told Frida that Brian was gay one day when he had a particular rage in the office and threw a teapot at her. She asked John Lennon, who sailed into the office, what was wrong with Brian? Why was he like that? And John's explanation for it was to say, Frida, if you and Brian were on a desert island, you'd be fine. And that was the way he explained it. And at 17, which is what she was, she didn't even know what he meant really. But the people used to leave. Brian was engaged he was engaged to be married to a woman called Sonia Seligman, who was in fact became an actress. And she was a big part of the Jewish community as well. And everyone was very excited. But when they went to parties, people used to leave notes in her pocket saying that Brian was gay. Which of course she didn't understand until the point that he broke up with her. And he broke up with her by explaining that his weekends in Spain were for other reasons other than, and I mean, heartbreaking. She was also a very young woman. I think the main thing about Brian was that when they met, John Lennon was 21 and Brian had just turned 27 in the September of the year that they met. And so he was older and he was fancy and he didn't speak like anyone in Liverpool. So it was immediately impressive to them. And even though Paul's auntie advised them, even when Brian was around in the room, you shouldn't trust Jews. Paul said, I don't think we should be saying that. And latterly, in these recent years, that's one of the things Paul has referenced. When I had to leave Brian and sort of say goodbye to him, and I have to say, every time I watch the film, I cry because saying goodbye, and I hope Tom doesn't go through this, saying goodbye to Brian is the hardest thing, because when you realize that he died at 32 years old and what he was capable of and who he managed and how he invested in people. Tom's absolutely right. I think his relationship with Scylla, I think it was Les that said, or I can't, that this relationship with Scylla was so very special. That's a big part of our film. And I mean, Scylla, did she know that Brian was gay? Probably yes, but he never ever wanted her to know. And when he was told that she did know, he cried. So I think that it was an enormous thing, and there is so much. He went through so much. Being gay in those times was so very difficult. Being Jewish and gay even harder. And I think that what I would like and what I wish, I mean, I noticed that a lot of older people go to see our film. It just opened in New York and it was an older audience. But what I really desperately want is for young people to see it, because the freedoms they don't think they have, they do have. And I like them to see what Brian went through and how hard it was. And I still miss him every day. If you saw my office, you'd know I was Brian mad. I hope that sort of, I don't know if that was 10 minutes or 6 or whatever, but I hope you see the film.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Brigit. Really super. And touching on those very important aspects of his identity that were the cause of conflicts for him in his life, but which are obviously absolutely integral to who he was. And very thrilling also to see that you're sitting in front of a picture of the old NEMS building. And I see from our chat that we have Alan Swerdlow, who designed the packaging for NEMS and knew Brian and was involved with the record shop. It sounds like maybe we can hear from him later. But well, thank you all. So far, it's been absolutely a wonderful discussion and wonderful to hear your thoughts on Brian and reflections on him. We're going to open it up now to our audience who are listening, I think, all over the world. So if you have a particular question, put it in the chat. We do have someone on who I'm going to go to first, actually, Rick Blasky, because Rick knew Judy Simons, who was you tell us, Rick, the story behind that, and also your connection with Paul McCartney. If I can ask you to keep it fairly brief, just because I can see we've got stacks and stacks of people who are all desperate to say things. But let's go to you, Rick, and hear about your connection with Brian.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks to you and Aviva for doing this. I mean, how great, that 50, 60 years on, we're still talking with such passion about the Beatles, who, frankly, I've been in the music business for 50 years and 45 years. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have been. Very briefly, my cousin was Hey Jude, Judith Simons. Judy was very close friends with Queenie. That's Judy sitting on the couch with the Beatles. Judy and Queenie, we come from Sheffield, as you can tell from my broad Yorkshire accent. And when Judy got her first job, she was a journalist and latterly became for 30 years the showbiz editor of the Daily Express, and that was the early 60s. So Queenie was very keen to ask Judy to get her son's band in the press. And Judy traveled everywhere with them, Hamburg, the States, absolutely everywhere. And the Hey Jude story very quickly was, in fact, when Judy died, 5 or 6 years ago, she was 93. The week before, we got an email from Paul to say, Dear Judy, in brackets, or should I say, Hey Jude? And, you know, a lot of people, and in all the obituaries, it references that. A lot of people think it was written for Julian, Hey Julian, Hey Jules. And it may well have been, but they always said to Judy, you are Hey Jude to us. Briefly, I ran EMI International for a few years and therefore worked very closely with Paul. And I have to say, he and Linda, what treasures, what wonderful, yes, that was us back in, God, the 80s, I guess, late 80s. And just wonderful, wonderful people. And the fact that I'm in this business is, you know, is a blessing, but to have had these connections is just magical, absolutely magical. And I always refer to music as being pre-Beatles or post-Beatles because I think they were the benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, one other thing is that our next door neighbours were Queenie's brother, Beryl, who I think was called Barnett originally, or Barney, Lorne and Beryl Hyman, who, Brigit, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Basil's father.
Yeah.
And what a great man he was, Beryl, Queenie's brother. I hope that's interesting.
Great. Thank you very much, Rick. That was lovely to hear your reflections there. I think we might have some more from Jen. Is Jen Jankel in our audience?
I'm afraid not, but she sent her best wishes.
Okay. Just before we go on, I just wanted to ask, I know, Brigit, in your film, you have scenes where you see the family celebrating Shabbat, and there is the Jewish element is there. Tom, do you touch on the Jewish element much, or is it mostly looking at his gay identity in your play?
I do touch on it, yeah, definitely. I think you can't remove Brian from either of those contexts. They're both incredibly important. So yeah, well, you have to come and see the play to see how I've entwined that in. But it is yeah, as Les said, he was othered in two ways. And both of them are crucial to how he moved through the world.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go to some questions now, some other questions from our audience. So we've got Eileen Con. Eileen, do you want to ask your question to Tom and Brigit, if we can pick you up in the spotlight? Or I know we've got a big audience, so I could just ask your question. Oh, there we go. We've got Eileen.
Oh, am I on?
You're on. Yes, over to you.
This is indeed an honor. I'm going. You can see I've got my Beatle records behind me. Tom, I'm in Toronto. It's a snowy day, but I'd love to pop over to England to see your play. My sisters and I were big fans, and but I just wanted to know, like, with your research and also for Brigit, like in her film Midas Man, did you contact Paul McCartney or Ringo Starr for any reference of like what it might have been like, especially the Cavern Club? Were they in any way participating, like, you know, participants in your background research?
I don't know about Brigit. I wasn't able to to connect with them. I did manage to speak to lots of other interesting people. A really great source for me was Philip Norman, who's one of the biographers and was really connected at the time. He's been fantastic, also a Jewish man. Well, actually, his wife's Jewish, but connected to that culture. And he was very helpful. And I managed to speak to Cilla Black's PR, who was really, really close to her, to give a really... So there's lots of characters from the times. It sounds like Brigit managed to reach people that I wasn't able to access.
Yeah, I like I said, obviously, yes, Basil Hyman was alive, and I spent a lot of time with him, and subsequently James, his son, who is lovely, and in fact, you mentioned Beryl. Beryl actually persuaded Brian to kind of go back in there when he was kind of losing the will a bit about getting a record company to sign them. It was Beryl who pushed Brian to do it. As for the Beatles, we got very close with through one of his it was through one of the girls, one of Paul's girls, and then Ringo when I was in Los Angeles, that was another. But by then everything was done, and to be honest, the moment they announced they were doing 4 movies with Sam Mendes, all the doors closed because there was no way they were going to be acknowledging a little film like Midas Man while they were about to launch, Paul Mescal as Paul McCartney, and so no, we didn't get any further. Unfortunately, I know they've seen it because Frida's still friendly with Ringo. Still, they communicate, so I know. And if we'd got it wrong and used them wrongly, I think we would have heard.
And if Brigit found it hard to get noticed with an amazing big film like hers, you can imagine where theatre falls in the pecking order. The only thing I'll add, if you can't see the play, is that it will be published. And a nice thing about being a playwright is often the plays are published, and mine are. So in I think early April, as soon as the play's opened, it will be available online. So do Google, and you can always read it if you're interested.
And here's just one more thing. Today at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is in Toronto, a show of Paul McCartney's, about 254 of his photographs from the years 1960 to 64 it's a show that's on display now at the Art Gallery from today. It's opening today, up until June the 6th or something like that. So I'm pumped. I can't wait to go and see it. And this evening has just been great. So thank you very much.
Great. And thank you, Elaine. Lovely to hear from you outside of the UK. And well, who knows who might be seeing your film, Brigit, or the play, Tom? We can only hope that maybe word will get to those Beatles who are still with us. Let's go to Alan Swerdlow next, because Alan, you have, as I mentioned, you have a particular connection to NEMS and to Brian. I'd love to hear you remembering Brian and that particular connection that you have. Oh, you're mute. Can we unmute you?
I'm not sure that you're mute. Your audio is just not working.
Oh, what a shame. We can't hear you, Alan. Have you got your sound up? We can't hear you. I can read out people can read it in the chat, but I think we might have to leave it, unfortunately. But just
quickly, Rebecca.
Sorry, Aviva.
Why don't you just quickly read Alan's?
That's right. That's what I was just about to do. Yeah. So Alan says, I was at school with John Lennon and then at art school a year ahead of John. I was also taught by Harry Dortch. Brian and my family attended the same shul. When he was considering taking on the Beatles, he invited me for lunch to ask my opinion. Later, he commissioned me to take pre-Ringo photos and design packaging for NEMS. I could go in more detail. Well, it's such a shame that we haven't heard that detail, Alan, but another time. And thank you so much for adding your memories to all those tonight. Well, I think now let's go to Joy Kestenbaum. You had a few comments. One, maybe a question for Les to find out a little bit more about his Jewish background. So, Joy, do you want to come on and have a word with Les? You asked about how Brian being Jewish was relevant.
Well, I don't know if I need to come on, but Tom talked about, the double being other, double other. But Lee mentioned at the beginning of his talk that he was going to say something, and then he finished. So I just thought I'd ask if
So
he had.
let me say something now. Thank you, Joy. And yes, I don't think Brian was overtly religious. I don't think it was an influence in that way. But when you look historically, especially with a psychological eye, then you'll see that, throughout history, the influence of Jewish individuals, Jewish culture on, as it were, the host, the parent culture has been enormous. And the phenomenon of Brian Epstein and the Beatles, you can see it in terms of that overall sort of overarching pattern. And the reasons for this, well, you've got to think in terms of the collective patterns. It's like there's a collective psyche. There's a zeitgeist, and the backdrop, which is a big story, and I'll try and keep it very quickly, but is the relationship basically between Christianity and Judaism, and the relative cultures, and there's been a kind of shadow relationship, using the term shadow in a kind of psychological sense, and that's had mainly negative effects in terms of anti-Semitism over the ages. Many historians of anti-Semitism made the point you can't really understand the virulence and the fantasies without bringing in some kind of psychopathology, collective psychopathology. But as with an individual, we have this darker side and it has a negative side. But when we turn to that side, that otherness in ourselves, and really try to integrate and work with it, then we find resources of creativity within. And it's the same at a collective level. So the reason why Jewish individuals, even in the Renaissance, the early Renaissance is very strongly influenced by Jewish ideas and Kabbalistic ideas. So the reason why we have this overarching pattern in history, Western culture, is to do with this backdrop of the cultures between Christianity and Judaism. As I say, it's the larger story, but I think we can understand this phenomenon, this huge phenomenon of the Beatles and Brian Epstein's role in that context. So Brian's Jewishness, it wasn't overtly important. He wasn't Jewish in the sense the way he was the Beatles' manager, but collectively, and as it were, more deeper in a psychological sense, it is important. Just in the same way that Tom is bringing out that point about the sort of the deeper connotations of being gay at a time when it was illegal. So these factors, I think, are very important. And since we're talking in the context of Jewish Renaissance, maybe it's important to bring this out as well.
Sorry, can I just add about his Jewishness just very quickly? He was a brilliant Hebrew student, in fact, and he did his bar mitzvah. They taught him the wrong portion. He was subsequently told it was the wrong portion of the week that he was doing it, and he learnt the other portion in the time. And he wrote his will when he was 24 years old, which is bizarre, but he wrote it, and in it he said he didn't want Kaddish to be said at his funeral, and that all of his goods that didn't, or personal things that didn't go to his family, he wanted sent to Israel. So he did have more of a Jewish, certainly sensibility than people think.
Yeah.
I had another question to follow up with that. I'm also a genealogist, so I was just curious where his family came from, and when they might have come to England. Does anyone know that?
His grandfather, Isaac, who opened the shop, in fact, was mainly didn't speak English, a point we make at the beginning of the film. He said, my grandfather came to this country without a word of English, Lithuania.
Thanks. really interesting aspects about his Jewish background that I certainly didn't know about.
And then my other question was for Brigit about your film. I see that you were in New York for the Q&A when it premiered, but I don't know if it's playing there at that theater anymore. I'm in New York, so I just wondered if it's going to be shown anywhere else.
At the new Plaza Cinema on the Upper West Side.
Yeah, but is it still playing there?
I will find out and I'll let Aviva and I'll send you the details. It's an indie cinema, so it goes in and out.
Yeah. We'll send out the details to people. Also, a quick one to Tom about the play. Is it touring? People want to know, and who is in the cast?
So I'm not able to talk about the cast yet, but they'll be announced in just a few weeks. So very close, and we'll be releasing a new poster because the image at the moment is like a holding image. So there'll be new artwork, including the cast announcement really soon. Really talented actors. For now, it's playing at the Kiln, but there's big ambition for future life of the show. As Rebecca said at the beginning, I used to be associate director at the Kiln, and we've got a good track record of bringing things into the West End. We recently did a play called Retrograde, which was some of the untold story of Sidney Poitier. So this is kind of in that realm. So our dream and our ambition is that it would go into the West End, but it depends slightly on the critics who have a lot of power in theatre. Let's see how it goes. What I will say is it's selling out, and I think the first 2 weeks are almost sold out already. So there's certainly an audience for it, as we all know, because we're here.
I'm sure there is. Yeah, we're getting massive interest, as you can see on our chat. So when we send out the details of the event today with the recording, if people want to see that, we'll also send out, as I say, details of the film showing and of the play. I think very sadly we're going to have to leave it there for the moment with your questions. If people do have very particular memories or things that they would like to discuss further or things they want to find out more about, you can email in directly to me at Jewish Renaissance, and I can pass on your questions to our guests. If they don't mind me doing that, if we can do that, that would be great. So thank you everyone who has contributed to our discussion. That's been brilliant. And I'll say a thank you to our speakers before we go to Aviva to close our event. So thank you to everybody. Huge thanks. I know my 13-year-old self would have been absolutely thrilled to have been given such a fascinating insight into the man who made the world's greatest band. And I'm sure that our discussion has resonated strongly with many of you tonight, as we can see it has. So thank you for your time, your insights, and your passion for Brian Epstein. Okay, let's go to Aviva to end our evening tonight.
Well, first of all, a huge thanks, especially to Brigit, to Tom, to Les, to Rebecca for chairing, and to Linda and Robin for making the films as well. And thank you as well. I mean, what an audience. We've got an audience with as many stories as we have on screen. And for Rick and his photographs, and I'm sorry we couldn't quite get Alan in, but there is a wealth of knowledge and information. So before I move on to what else JR is doing, just to say we are planning a trip to Liverpool. So watch this space. It's not been fully programmed and announced yet, but we're hoping that it's going to be February 2027. It's going to include trips to Calderstones, which was once Quarrybank School. It's going to involve visiting Brian Epstein's Shaw and the Cavern, hopefully, as well. So we'll have lots of Beatles stuff in that trip with people who knew them. And as a link to another event, by the way, in a few weeks' time, we're taking a group to see Yentl at the Marylebone Theatre. This is the Yiddish play about Yentl, and many of you will have seen the film, the Barbra Streisand film of Yentl, first ever film to win a Golden Globe by a female director. And I don't know if you know, but the final scene of that was shot in Liverpool as well. So we're also going to be doing some stuff around that when we do our Liverpool trip. And I'll tell you a bit more about what JR's doing, but I just want to speak to three things that got raised. One was people were asking, we heard about the Ontario Museum and can you see things here in London? So I used to work at the British Library before I took the job as publisher of Jewish Renaissance. I was there for 13 years, and in my entire 13 years, the only material that was on display the entire 13 years were the first drafts of the Beatles songs. So if you go to the Rip Black Gallery in the British Library, you can see, or they rotate which ones, but sometimes they've got on the back of an envelope the words for yesterday. They've got I think A Hard Day's Night, if I'm not wrong, was written on the back of Julian Lennon's birthday card. So all these kind of very, very first drafts, because Hunter Davis lent them to the British Library on condition there would always be something of the Beatles on display. So if you want to go along, and other people were saying, what about young people? We have had so much interest in the Beatles for young people. We are trying to reach new audiences. We do a lot of projects now with emerging artists and theatre makers. And I was Zooming with the 23-year-old who is doing some work for us in the theatre, telling her about this event. And she was so excited because the Beatles are back. Sasha, who I'm about to interview at Jewish Book Week, which I'll tell you about in a moment, his 7-year-old son, he said the first songs he learnt were the Beatles songs. So definitely their influence is still there, and we've got a young audience interested. But let me go on to add on to what we're doing. So in the next few weeks, on Monday, Leon Fenster, who created the big mural at JW3, has got a new illuminated Haggadah coming out. So you can see a Zoom with him talking about the first new fully illuminated Haggadah in Britain for many years. We have many JR co-sponsored events at Jewish Book Week from Latin America, from the former Soviet Union, as well as with British artists and writers. We've got walking tours of the City of London through Jewish Book Week. So please come along to some of that. And then I'll give you just one more film event. Our programme is huge and we'll send information out tomorrow. But we've got an upcoming event on Hester Street, the making of Hester Street. There's a new book out by Julia Wagner. So I hope we'll see you all at some of those events. But I also hope that you'll appreciate our work is doing events like this and connecting to historic Jewish culture, but also supporting the production of new Jewish culture and emerging creatives. So if you would like to support our work, either by subscribing to the magazine or donating, we'd love to have you help us out and become part of the JR family. So thank you for that. And thank you again to Brigit, to Tom, to Les. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.